The smell of ozone and sterile lavender always permeated the halls of the Aethelgard High Archive. It was a scent that promised eternity, a olfactory reassurance that nothing had changed in 3,000 years, and nothing ever would. We, the Zillions, took great pride in that. We are the curators of existence, the ones who catalog the slow, beautiful decay of civilizations into art. My primary sensory nodes were focused on the data slate before me when Captain Kaelen Vance walked in. Even after 2 cycles of his presence at the Academy, the sound of his footsteps remained a jarring anomaly. Most of us floated or skittered with the grace of glass on silk. Vance, however, walked with a heavy rhythmic thud that suggested he was constantly reminding the floor of its obligation to hold his weight. "Good morning, Zek," he said. His voice was like grinding stones, rough and weathered by atmospheres I never intended to visit. I extended a translucent manipulator toward him. "Morning, Captain. You are late for the Comparative Antiquity Seminar. Professor Thal Rin is currently explaining the sublime uselessness of the Vordonian crystal shields." Vance leaned against a pillar of polished obsidian. "Uselessness, huh? Sounds like a waste of a good morning." "It is art, Captain," I corrected, my logic circuits fluttering in mild irritation. "The Vordonians reached the total pacifism threshold 5 centuries ago. Their shields are now woven from light and poetry. They are meant to be seen, not hit." Vance pulled a small fibrous stick from his pocket, a toothpick he called it, and began to chew on it. "If you can't hit it, it isn't a shield. It's a lamp." This was the fundamental friction between us. To the hegemony, history was a gallery. To Vance, history was a toolkit. He was a representative of the United Soul Command, a species that had only been part of the Galactic fold for 75 years. Most species spent their first century in the hegemony learning to paint or compose symphonies. The humans spent theirs asking for better topographical maps of the outer rim. We entered the lecture hall just as Thal Rin was reaching his crescendo. The professor was a lithoid, a being of living emerald who spoke in resonant hums. On the central holographic dais, a series of assignments were listed. For the midterm practical, the professor hummed, his light pulsing a soft violet of encouragement. "You will each select a piece of your ancestral defensive equipment. You will not merely research it, you will recreate it. I want to see the craftsmanship, the aesthetic choices, the soul of the era, when your people still felt the need to hide behind physical barriers. Show me the transition from fear to beauty." The hall rippled with excitement. Scylla, a delicate sylphid, began sketching a gown of refractive gas. Boros, the hulking Grendel, whispered about carving a ceremonial shell from dragon bone. It was all so very civilized. I watched Vance. He wasn't sketching. He wasn't whispering. He was staring at the holographic prompt with an expression that I can only describe as predatory. It wasn't anger. It was the look of a mathematician who had just been asked to solve a problem for which he already possessed the absolute answer. He raised his hand. It was a blunt, scarred limb, missing the tip of the smallest finger. "Yes, Captain Vance," Thal Rin asked, his facets glittering. "About the recreation," Vance started, his voice cutting through the soft murmurs of the class. "Does it have to be a replica?" The professor paused. "The curriculum assumes the originals are either in museums or lost to time. We do not expect you to possess actual artifacts of such primitive nature." Vance stood up. His uniform was the standard academy gray, but it sat on him like it was an inconvenience. "My family has a tradition, Professor. We don't really do replicas. We keep the real thing. It's been passed down for 32 generations." The room went silent. A 32-generation lineage of a single object was statistically improbable for any species, let alone one as volatile as humanity. Thal Rin's light shifted to a skeptical yellow. "You claim to have functional armor from your pre-spaceflight era?" Vance nodded. "Solid steel and boiled leather, heavy as a mountain and twice as stubborn." I felt my internal sensors spike. "Captain, that would be a priceless historical treasure. It should be in a vacuum-sealed vault, not in your student quarters." Vance looked at me, and for a second I saw something in his eyes that made my fluid core chill. "It's not a treasure, Zek. It's a tool." He turned back to the professor. I can bring it in for the presentation, but I need a clarification on the grading rubric. You said you wanted to see the soul of the era. Thelrin hummed a confused affirmative. Indeed, the cultural resonance of the piece. Right, Vance said, and a slow, dark smile crept across his face. Then you have to tell me how you want it. My family's set hasn't been touched since the siege of New Kyoto during the Unification Wars. So do you want me to bring it in cleaned and polished for the cameras? Or would you prefer it with the original bloodstains intact? The silence that followed was not the respectful quiet of an archive. It was the suffocating weight of a vacuum. I saw Scylla's gas form flicker in distress. Boros actually recoiled. Bloodstains. The word was a profanity in this house of light. Professor Tal Rin's light turned a stark, jagged red, the color of profound systemic error. Miss Vance, this is an academic institution. We do not handle biological residue from ancient atrocities. Vance shrugged, seemingly oblivious to the horror he had just unleashed. Your call, Professor. I just figured if we're talking about authenticity, we should talk about what the armor was actually for. It wasn't for dancing, it was for making sure the other guy's sword didn't end up in your lungs. He sat back down, picking up his physical notebook and a pen, an archaic device that used liquid ink, and began to write. He looked perfectly at peace. The rest of us, however, felt as though a predator had just walked into a nursery and asked for a menu. I leaned over, my voice a frantic whisper. You cannot bring blood into this hall, Kaelen. It is a biohazard. It is monstrous. Vance didn't look up from his notes. Peace is a beautiful thing, Zek. Truly. But it's made your people forget what the world looks like when the lights go out. He tapped his pen against the desk. 1, 2, 3 times. I'll clean it, he said softly. But the dents stay. You can't polish out a memory of a bullet. I spent the next 3 days in a state of heightened anxiety. My logic loops were stuck on the phrase original bloodstains. In the hegemony, we had long ago moved past the need for physical conflict. Disputes were settled via the hegemonic court of probability, where AI simulations determined the most likely outcome of a disagreement, and both parties accepted the result. It was efficient. It was clean. Humanity, however, seemed to have missed the memo on efficiency. I found myself at the door of Vance's quarters on the 4th floor of the Alpha Wing. The door was standard reinforced polymer, but as I approached, I heard a sound that didn't belong in the academy. Clang, scrape, clang. The sound of metal meeting metal. It was a rhythmic, heavy noise that vibrated in my sensory nodes. I hesitated, then signaled the door. Come in, Zek. I know it's you. You're the only one who breathes that loudly. The door slid open. I stepped inside and immediately felt my processors overwhelmed. The room was supposed to be a minimalist cube of white light and comfort foam. Vance had transformed it into a workshop. Tools I didn't recognize, heavy hammers, oily rags, and jugs of caustic-smelling fluids, were scattered across the floor. In the center of the room, hanging from a heavy industrial frame, was the object. I stopped. My manipulators curled in a defensive gesture. It was a suit of armor, but it looked nothing like the elegant, holographic designs we studied. It was a dark, brooding mass of iron and shadow. Is that it? I asked, my voice trembling. Vance was standing in front of it, wearing nothing but a pair of rugged trousers and a thin shirt soaked in sweat. He was holding a piece of coarse cloth, rubbing a section of the breastplate with a ferocity that seemed almost violent. This is the Aegis of Saul, he said, not looking at me. Well, that's what my great-grandfather called it. To everyone else, it's just the iron-bound plate. I moved closer, drawn by a morbid fascination. The metal was not smooth. It was a landscape of trauma. There were deep gouges across the chest, long furrows where something sharp had tried to tear its way through. There were circular indentations that looked like frozen ripples in water. What are those? I pointed to the holes. Bullets, Vance replied. Early kinetic projectiles. High velocity, low mass. This layer here is a carbon steel alloy from the 20th century. My ancestor, Elias, had it welded over the original 14th century plate. He was a trench runner in the Great War. 14th century, I echoed, my mind racing through the calculations. That would make the base of this suit over 1,200 years old. 1,242 years, to be precise, Vance said. He stopped scrubbing and looked at the suit with a strange, tired affection. It's been modified in every century. When the humans hit the stars, we added a layer of ceramic weave underneath the iron. When we fought the pirates in the belt, we added magnetic seals for vacuum. It's not a museum piece, Zek. It's a record of every time someone tried to kill my family and failed. I reached out a manipulator, touching the cold, dark surface. The metal felt heavy, not just in weight, but in presence. Our zillion archives were full of data, millions of petabytes of information. But this object held something data couldn't capture. It held the actual physical resistance of life against death. Vance picked up a heavy helmet. It was a grim, faceless bucket of steel with a narrow slit for the eyes. It had a dent on the crown that looked like it had been made by a falling star. My father wore this on Mars, he said quietly. He was part of the first terraforming security detail. A pressure valve blew during a sandstorm. A piece of shrapnel the size of a dinner plate hit him right here. He traced the dent with his thumb. If he'd been wearing the standard issue composite helmet, his head would have been a red mist. But he was a Vance. He wore the iron. He walked away with a concussion and a story. Why? I asked, the question bubbling up from my core. Why keep it? Why subject yourselves to this weight? The hegemony offers protection. Our sensors can detect a threat from 3 light years away. Our drones can neutralize any aggressor before they even see our ships. There is no need for iron anymore. Vance finally looked at me. His eyes were a pale, piercing blue. You think the hegemony is the end of history, Zek? You think because you've had a few thousand years of peace, the universe has suddenly decided to be kind? Isn't it? We have eradicated hunger. We have silenced the guns. Vance laughed. It was a short, sharp sound. You haven't silenced the guns, Zek. You've just put them in a cupboard and forgotten where you put the key. Humans, we don't trust cupboards. We know that the universe is a dark, hungry place, and eventually something will come along that doesn't care about your treaties or your poetry. Something that only understands the language of no. He slapped the breastplate. This is my no. I felt a surge of logic defiance. You are paranoid, Captain. It is a primitive trait. Maybe, he conceded, but tell me this. When the alarms finally go off, and they will, Zek, they always do, who do you want standing in front of you? A poet with a light shield? Or a man who's been preparing for that moment for 1,000 years? I had no answer. According to all hegemony protocols, his mindset was a psychological relic, a remnant of a violent evolutionary past that should have been pruned away. And yet, looking at him standing there in the dim light, covered in oil and sweat, he looked more real than anything I had ever seen in the archive. The sensors in the room suddenly chimed. It was the station-wide alert, but not the usual rhythmic tone for a docking ship or a scheduled maintenance cycle. This was a jagged, discordant shriek. Code black, system failure, unidentified breach. Vance's entire demeanor changed in a microsecond. The tired student was gone. In his place was something cold, efficient, and terrifyingly focused. He didn't check the data slate. He didn't ask questions. He grabbed a heavy leather strap and began to cinch the breastplate onto his torso. Kaelen? What are you doing? I asked, my internal systems flickering with fear. The automated defense drones will handle it. Vance ignored me. He shoved his arms into the iron greaves, the metal clicking into place with a sound of finality. He moved with a practiced speed that suggested he had done this thousands of times in the dark. Zek, he said, his voice dropping an octave into a command tone. Get to the reinforced sublevel. Now. But the professor, the class. Vance grabbed the heavy helmet and slammed it over his head. The sound of the seals engaging was like the closing of a tomb. Through the narrow eye slit, I saw a flicker of that blue fire. Forget the class, Zek, his muffled voice growled. The assignment just got moved up. He reached into a hidden compartment in the armor's frame and pulled out a long, heavy object wrapped in oilcloth. He tore the cloth away to reveal a sword. It wasn't decorative. It was a thick, brutal blade of dark steel. its edge shimmering with a molecular honed finish that seemed to swallow the room's light. "Go, Zek! Move!" I didn't wait for a third command. My logic circuits were screaming, "Danger!" But my core was gripped by a realization that was far more terrifying. For 30 centuries, the galaxy had been a gallery of beautiful things. But as I fled down the hall, I heard the heavy, rhythmic thud of iron boots following me. And for the first time in my life, I wasn't afraid of the man making the noise. I was afraid of whatever was out there that made a man like Kaelen Vance necessary. The Aethelgard station was designed to be a testament to the triumph of spirit over matter. It was a sprawling construct of translucent carbonite and gravity-anchored gardens, floating in the velvet dark of the Velonis Reach. In the 3 centuries since its completion, not a single light had flickered out of sequence. Not a single voice had been raised in anger. It was a masterpiece of static perfection, a place where the most dangerous thing was a dissenting opinion on a piece of 17th century verse. When the sirens began their jagged, desperate wail, the sound was so alien to the environment that many of the residents simply stood still, assuming it was a performance. I saw a group of lithoids in the central plaza tilted their heads in unison, their crystalline facets vibrating as they tried to categorize the frequency. They thought it was music. They thought it was art. I knew better. My internal logic processors were receiving data streams from the station's exterior sensors, and the numbers, written out in my mind as cold, terrifying constants, were failing to make sense. 0. That was the reading from the long-range arrays. Not 0 as in an empty void, but 0 as in a complete absence of data return. It was as if a section of the galaxy, measuring 3 light-years across, had simply been deleted from the manifest of existence. We called this phenomenon the silence. It was a theoretical threat we discussed in high-level strategy seminars, a boogeyman for academics. It wasn't supposed to be here. "Zek, move your primary manipulators or I will carry you like a sack of grain." Vance's voice boomed through the corridor, amplified by the Vox grill of his helmet. He looked like a nightmare carved from a dying star. The dark iron of his breastplate caught the flickering emergency lights, turning them into dull, bruised shadows. He didn't run like we did. He moved with a controlled, predatory momentum that ignored the station's artificial gravity fluctuations. "The automated defenses," I sputtered, my fluid core churning with a frantic, unorganized heat. "The hegemony predictor is supposed to calculate the intercept vectors. Why aren't the drones launching?" "The predictor is a glorified calculator," Vance growled, grabbing me by my upper appendage and hauling me toward the transit hub. "It's trying to find a logical solution to a problem that doesn't use your logic. The silence doesn't hack your systems, Zek. It just ignores them. It's like trying to argue with a landslide." We reached the central transit hub, a massive chamber of soaring arches and light bridges that connected the 4 wings of the station. It was chaos. Hundreds of students and faculty members from a dozen different species were milling about, their colorful garments and delicate frames clashing with the harsh red glow of the emergency beacons. Professor Thal Rin was there, his emerald form pulsing a frantic, strobe-like white. His light tapestry, the beautiful, purely symbolic shield he had been so proud of, was activated. It hung around him like a veil of shimmering gossamer, casting soft violet patterns on the floor. "Quiet, please. Everyone maintain your logical composure." Thalrin hummed, his resonance cracking with a high-pitched vibration of pure terror. "The station AI is merely experiencing a minor synchronization error. We must remain here and wait for the diplomatic protocols to be established." I looked at Vance. His helmet tilted slightly as he scanned the room. Through the eye slit, I saw the cold blue focus of a man who was already counting exits and calculating cover. "Diplomatic protocols," he whispered, and the bitterness in his voice was thick enough to taste. "They're bringing a poem to a knife fight." "Vance!" Scylla, the Sylphid student, drifted toward us, her gas form thinning into a pale, translucent mist of fear. "What is happening? The lights are... they are feeling wrong." "Get down, Scylla," Vance commanded. He didn't explain. He didn't comfort. He just pointed to the reinforced base of a nearby obsidian pillar. "Find the lowest point you can and stay there. Zek, get behind her." I started to protest, my academic pride still struggling against the mounting evidence of disaster. Captain, we are at the center of the most advanced station in the quadrant. Surely the ceiling exploded. It wasn't a blast of fire or sound. It was a sudden, violent tearing of reality. A section of the beautiful, translucent dome simply vanished, replaced by a jagged hole of absolute black. Through the gap, I didn't see stars. I saw nothing. A void so profound it felt like a weight on my sensory nodes. Then the things came through. They looked like shards of obsidian glass held together by magnetic static. They had no faces, no limbs, just jagged geometric forms that shifted and pulsed with a sickly, gray light. The Null Walkers, the agents of the silence. The station's internal security drones, elegant, orb-like machines polished to a mirror finish, floated toward the intruders. They fired pulses of concentrated light, the kind of non-lethal deterrence the hegemony favored. The pulses hit the shards and were simply absorbed, not reflected, not resisted. The light just stopped existing. The Null Walkers didn't fire back. They simply drifted forward, and where their jagged edges touched the drones, the machines didn't explode. They crumbled. They turned into a fine gray dust that drifted in the artificial breeze like ash. A scream erupted from the crowd, a sound so raw and primal it seemed to shatter the very air of the hub. One of the shards had drifted into a group of students. In an instant, 3 Yanari scholars were gone, reduced to heaps of gray silt on the pristine floor. Thalrin stepped forward, his emerald body glowing with a desperate, defiant light. "Stop! We are a peaceful collective. We offer no resistance." He raised his light tapestry shield. It was a beautiful thing, woven from the dreams of 1,000 poets, designed to symbolize the invulnerability of truth. A Null Walker drifted toward him. Its jagged edge touched the shimmering violet light. The shield didn't flicker. It didn't hold. It tore like wet paper. The professor's light form dimmed as the void shards drew closer, his screams silenced by the absolute cold of the intruders. Everyone was running now, a frantic, mindless stampede toward the escape pods. But the shards were everywhere, drifting through the walls as if the station's armor were nothing more than a suggestion. Vance didn't run. He stepped forward, the heavy thud of his iron boots echoing in the sudden, terrifying silence of the hub. He had his sword drawn, that brutal, dark slab of steel that I had mocked only hours before. "Vance, no!" I screamed, my manipulators curling in horror. "You can't fight those things. They aren't matter. They aren't energy." Vance didn't look back. He settled into a low, wide stance, his weight distributed evenly across his iron-shod greaves. He looked small against the towering arches of the hub, a relic of a primitive past standing in the ruins of a perfect future. "They're matter enough for me, Zek," he growled. "They're here, and so am I." A Null Walker, a shard the size of a human, pivoted in the air, its jagged edges humming with a static that made my logic cores ache. It surged forward, a blur of gray light. Vance moved. It wasn't the fluid, dancing grace of a martial artist. It was the explosive, focused violence of a machine designed to survive. He didn't try to parry the shard. He didn't try to block it. He lunged, his entire body weight behind the dark steel of his blade. The sword struck the shard. For a heartbeat, nothing happened. Then a sound erupted that I will never forget. The sound of iron breaking the laws of a civilization that had forgotten what iron was for. The sword didn't pass through. It didn't crumble. Because it wasn't made of light or poetry or digital constructs. It was made of raw, stubborn earth metal, forged in fire and tempered in the blood of 30 generations. It was too dumb to be ignored by the void. It was too real to be deleted. The shards shattered. It didn't turn to dust. It broke into 1,000 pieces of inanimate glass that clattered against the obsidian floor with a mundane, beautiful sound. Vance stood over the wreckage, his breath coming in heavy, metallic rasps through his helmet. He looked at the other shards, his sword dripping with a strange, dark ichor that wasn't blood, but wasn't nothing. "Who's next?" he snarled. For the first time in 3,000 years, the Aethelgard station saw a victory. It wasn't one with logic, it wasn't one with peace, it was one with the weight of 1,000 years of practiced, necessary violence. And as I watched him, a single thought flickered through my panicked mind. We had been so busy teaching him how to be civilized that we had forgotten to thank him for being a monster. The victory in the hub was a brief, flickering candle in a hurricane. While Vance had shattered one of the null walkers, 10 more were already drifting through the upper galleries, their gray static hum drowning out the station's dying AI. The hub was no longer a place of learning. It was a slaughterhouse where the cattle were still trying to negotiate with the butcher. Vance turned back to me, his helmet splattered with that dark, oily void residue. His movements were frantic but precise. He grabbed Scylla by her gaseous shoulder, a feat of incredible delicacy for someone in 50 kilograms of iron, and shoved her toward me. Zek, take her. Get to the maintenance core, Sector 7G. It's the only part of this floating glass house that's built with actual structural steel. The light bridges are going to fail in 3 minutes. If you're not across the central span by then, you're drifting into the void. What about you? I asked, my manipulators trembling so violently I could barely maintain my cohesive form. You can't stay here. There are too many of them. I'm the distraction, Vance said, and he sounded as if he were discussing a grocery list. These things are attracted to complexity. They like your high-energy systems, your delicate little light shows. I'm going to head to the power relay and give them a target they can't resist. He looked at the sword in his hand, then at the terrified students huddling behind the obsidian pillars. Someone has to hold the door, Zek. That's the assignment. The assignment. He was still talking about the class. He was still playing the role of the student, even as he prepared to die for a civilization that didn't even like the way he smelled. It's illogical, I screamed. You are one biological unit. Your survival probability is less than 0.004%. Vance stepped closer, his armored chest plate inches from my sensory nodes. The iron felt hot, radiating a dull warmth that was the only comforting thing in the room. Statistics don't breathe, Zek. People do. Now move! He didn't wait for my compliance. He turned and sprinted toward the upper galleries, his iron boots striking the obsidian floor with a sound like a drumbeat of war. He didn't look back. I grabbed Scylla, her gas form so thin she felt like a cold breeze, and began to run. The journey across the central span was a nightmare of failing geometry. The light bridges, those beautiful, weightless paths of pure energy, were flickering. Every time a null walker touched the station's frame, the power grid shuddered. I saw a group of scholars halfway across the span to the beta wing when their bridge simply ceased to exist. They didn't fall. There was no gravity. They simply drifted into the dark, their silent screams lost in the roar of the vacuum. We reached the maintenance core just as the central span collapsed. I pulled Scylla through the heavy, manual latch door, a relic of a previous design era that the hegemony had deemed unnecessarily industrial. The door slammed shut with a heavy, satisfying thud of actual physical metal. Inside, the air was thick with the smell of grease and old coolant. It was ugly. It was cramped. It was perfect. I collapsed against the wall, my fluid core pulsing a dull, exhausted gray. Scylla huddled in a corner, her form slowly regaining some density. "Why did he stay?" she whispered, her voice a tiny, fragile vibration. "He doesn't even belong here. We were unkind to him, Zek. We laughed at his armor. We called his people the violent toddlers of the galaxy. Why would he die for us?" I looked at the heavy iron rivets in the wall. I thought about the suit Vance was wearing, the iron from the 14th century, the steel from the 20th, the ceramics from the 23rd. "He isn't dying for us, Scylla," I said, the realization settling into my logic loops like a heavy stone. "He's dying for the people who haven't been born yet." I pulled up my data slate, my manipulator steady now. I had a task. Vance was out there alone in the dark, and if I couldn't fight with iron, I would fight with the only thing I had: information. I bypassed the station's main AI, which was currently screaming in a digital loop of despair, and accessed the low-level hardwired sensors of the power relay. The screen flickered to life. It was a grainy, low-resolution feed, but I could see him. Vance was in the heart of the relay, a chamber filled with massive, rotating coils of superconducting wire. The air was thick with ozone and the gray static of the null walkers. There were 5 of them. They were circling him like sharks made of glass. Vance was a mess. His left arm guard was gone, torn away by a strike that must have been devastating. His helmet was cracked, a jagged line running from the eye slit to the jaw. But he was still standing. He had his back to the primary power coupling. He was the only thing between the intruders and the station's heart. He was talking. Even through the distorted audio of the maintenance feed, I could hear him. "Come on then, you geometric bastards," he snarled, his voice a ragged edge of defiance. "You want complexity? You want history? I've got 1,200 years of it right here." He lunged. It was a brutal, ugly movement. He took a strike to his shoulder, a gray pulse that would have disintegrated any lithoid or sylphid, and used the momentum to drive his sword into the core of a null walker. The shard exploded, but the strike had a cost. Vance fell to one knee, his armor sparking with a feedback loop of energy. He looked exhausted. The weight of the iron, which he had carried so easily in the classroom, was now a burden that seemed ready to crush him. "Vance," I shouted into the comms link, knowing he probably couldn't hear me. "Get out of there. The relay is going to overload." Through the screen, I saw him tilt his head. He reached up and unlatched his helmet. He threw the shattered iron bucket aside, revealing his face. He was bleeding. A deep cut ran across his forehead. The blood, bright, vivid, human red, trailing down his cheek and dripping onto his breastplate. He looked at the camera. He didn't smile. He just looked tired. "Zek," he said, his voice surprisingly clear. "You still there?" "I'm here, Kaelen. I'm here." "Good. Listen to me. The hegemony. They're going to try to forget this. They're going to want to go back to their poems and their light shields. They're going to say this was a fluke, a statistical error." I felt my fluid core tighten. "I know." "Don't let them," Vance said. He stood up, using his sword as a crutch. He was facing the last four null walkers, who were closing in for the kill. Tell them that the armor isn't about the fight. It's about the memory. We wear it so we never forget that the peace they love was bought with the blood of people who were willing to be ugly." He looked at his breastplate, the iron that had seen the siege of New Kyoto, the Great War, the Belt Wars. "My grandfather cleaned this armor every Sunday," he whispered, more to himself than to me. "He said it was the only way to keep the ghosts from getting too loud. I guess I'm just joining the choir now." The null walkers surged forward. Vance didn't flinch. He didn't cry out. He raised his sword, a lone man in a suit of battered iron, and met the darkness head-on. The screen erupted in a blinding flash of white light as the power relay overloaded. The maintenance core shuddered. Scylla screamed. I sat in the dark, my sensors recording nothing but the sound of my own rhythmic breathing. The station fell silent. But it was a different kind of silence this time. It wasn't the void of the null walkers. It was the silence of a house where the guardian had finally gone to sleep, and the children were left to wonder why they had ever been afraid of the dark. I looked at my manipulators. They were covered in a fine gray dust. I didn't clean them. I wanted to remember the weight of it. I wanted to remember the cost of the iron. Because Kaelen Vance was right. The hegemony would try to forget. They would try to polish away the memory of the blood and the dents. But I wouldn't. I am Zek, a scholar of the Zillion Archive, and I have a new assignment. I am going to write a history of the Ironbound, not as an artifact, not as a curiosity, but as a warning. For the universe is a dark and hungry place, and eventually the lights always go out. The aftermath of a catastrophe has its own unique geometry. In the hegemony, we are taught that destruction is a chaotic, entropic state, but the ruins of Aethelgard Station possessed a terrifying, mathematical precision. Where the null walkers had passed, the matter wasn't merely broken, it was absent. Sections of the grand galleries looked as though a giant had taken a bite out of the architecture, leaving behind edges so sharp they could cut a sensory node. I emerged from the maintenance core 3 hours after the whiteout. Scylla followed me, her gaseous form shimmering with a sickly, iridescent hue that indicated severe emotional shock. The station's artificial atmosphere was thin, smelling of ozone, and the scorched metallic scent of the power relay's death throes. Is it over?" Scylla whispered. Her voice was a mere vibration in the thin air, a ghost of the vibrant scholar she had been 4 cycles ago. I didn't answer. My logic circuits were busy processing the incoming data from the few surviving exterior sensors. The silence hadn't left. It had simply receded to the edge of the Velonis Reach, hanging there like a shroud of absolute darkness. It was waiting. We moved toward the power relay. Every step was a struggle against the station's failing gravity. The beautiful light bridges were gone, replaced by jagged struts of structural steel and carbonite. Along the way, we saw the others, the survivors. They were huddled in the shadows of the obsidian pillars, their faces masks of incomprehension. To a lithoid whose species has known peace for 10,000 years, an attack like this isn't just a tragedy, it's an ontological impossibility. Their worldview was shattered more thoroughly than the glass. "Zek, wait," Scylla said, drifting to a stop near the entrance of the primary corridor. "Look." On the floor, amidst a pile of gray dust that used to be a security drone, lay a small object. It was a physical writing implement, a pen, Vance's pen. It was bent, its plastic casing cracked, but the ink inside had leaked out, staining the white floor in a stubborn, dark blotch. It looked like blood. To my zillion eyes, it was a reminder that even in a world of digital perfection, the most primitive things leave the most permanent marks. We reached the power relay. The chamber was a tomb of twisted, superconducting coils. The air was so cold that ice crystals were beginning to form on my translucent manipulators. In the center of the room, standing before the blackened shell of the power coupling, was the iron. It sat there like a discarded skin. The breastplate was propped up against a twisted strut, its surface covered in a layer of frost. The sword was driven deep into the floor, the metal vibrating with a faint residual hum. But the man was gone. "Vance?" I called out, my voice cracking. "Kaelen?" There was no reply. No heavy thud of boots. No growled military slang. Only the sound of the station's hull groaning under the thermal stress of the vacuum. I approached the armor. The helmet lay several meters away, its eye slit, staring blankly at the ceiling. I reached out a manipulator and touched the iron. It was cold. So cold it felt like it was absorbing the heat from my very core. "He didn't make it," Scylla breathed, her form dimming to a sorrowful indigo. He's gone." I didn't feel the surge of logic I expected. I didn't feel the relief of a survival probability confirmed. I felt a hollow, aching void that no archive could fill. He had been a violent toddler, a relic of an era we despised. And yet, standing in the presence of his empty shell, I realized that the iron was the only thing in this room that hadn't surrendered. The silence was broken by a new sound, the high-pitched harmonic chime of hegemony peacekeeping vessels. I looked up through the jagged hole in the ceiling and saw 3 ships descending. They were beautiful, needle-like constructs of white light and silver, moving with a grace that felt obscene in the middle of a graveyard. They landed in the hub, and a dozen peacekeepers emerged. They were Vordonians, their crystalline bodies glowing with a serene, authoritative blue. They didn't carry weapons. They carried calming arrays, devices designed to project waves of emotional tranquility to pacify traumatized populations. One of them, a high-ranking official named Exxon, glided toward us. His light was a soothing, patronizing lavender. "Citizens," he hummed, the sound vibrating in my logic centers. "You are safe now. The hegemony has established a containment perimeter. The anomaly has been repelled." "Anomaly?" I asked, my manipulators curling in a sudden, sharp anger. "It wasn't an anomaly, Exxon. It was a massacre." Exxon's light flickered toward the empty suit of iron. "We have already analyzed the sensor logs. It was a localized space-time fluctuation, likely triggered by the station's aging power grid. Your human companion's actions were brave, if somewhat primitive, but ultimately the situation resolved itself through entropic stabilization." I stared at him. Or rather, I stared at the way his light refused to acknowledge the blood on the floor, the shards of the null walkers, or the empty armor. "He bought us time," Scylla shouted, her gas form flaring into a jagged red. "He fought them. He shattered them with that sword." Exxon's light remained a steady, immovable lavender. "Hallucinations are a common side effect of exposure to void static, child. We will provide the necessary psychological realignment. As for these objects," he gestured toward the iron armor, "they are biohazardous materials, Primitive alloys contaminated with unidentified residues. They must be destroyed to ensure the station's environmental integrity. Destroyed? I moved between Exxon and the armor. My logic circuits were screaming at me to stand aside, to obey the authority of the hegemony. But my core was remembering the weight of Vance's hand on my shoulder. No. Exxon's light shifted to a cold, hard white. Citizen Zek, you are experiencing a logic failure. Move aside. This is history, I said, my voice steady for the first time in my life. This is the 32nd generation of Soul. You don't get to delete it because it makes your peaceful narrative look fragile. Zek, please, Scylla whispered, her fear returning. Don't fight them. I ignored her. I looked at the peacekeepers, at their beautiful, useless arrays. You're afraid, aren't you? Exxon paused. We do not feel fear, Zillion. Liar, I said. You're afraid because if you admit what happened here, if you admit that Vance's primitive steel worked where your civilized light failed, then the last 3,000 years of hegemony history becomes a lie. You're afraid that the universe is still dangerous and you've forgotten how to handle it. The peacekeepers moved forward, their light arrays humming with a forced aggressive tranquility. But before they could reach me, a new sound cut through the chamber. A cough, a dry, hacking human cough. It came from the shadows behind the power coupling. I turned, my sensory nodes straining. A figure moved in the darkness. It was a man, stripped to the waist, his skin a patchwork of bruises, burns, and dark, oily stains. He was leaning against a secondary strut, his breathing ragged and wet. Kaelen? I whispered. Vance looked up. His face was a mask of exhaustion, his left eye swollen shut. He looked at the peacekeepers, then at me. Zek, he rasped, his voice a ghost of its former self. What's the sit rep? He's alive! Scylla surged toward him, her form glowing with a sudden, joyous gold. Vance tried to stand, but his legs buckled. He fell forward, and for a moment, I thought he would hit the floor. But he didn't. He caught himself on the edge of the iron breastplate, his fingers digging into the ancient metal. Exxon stepped forward, his light pulsing with an uneasy flicker. Captain Vance, you must remain still. You're contaminated. We must transport you to a quarantine facility for evaluation. Vance looked at the Vordonian. He didn't see an authority figure. He saw a man with a light shield standing in a room full of bodies. Quarantine? He croaked. You can stick your quarantine where the sun doesn't shine, Sparky. He turned his head and spat a mouthful of blood onto the floor. I'm not done with my presentation yet, he said, his eyes finding mine. I moved to his side, supporting his weight. My manipulators felt the heat of his skin, the frantic, stubborn thud of his heart. He was a broken man, a biological unit at the edge of failure. And yet, as I looked at him, I realized that the hegemony was wrong. Courage isn't the absence of fear. Exxon and his peacekeepers, they had no fear because they had no understanding of danger. They were hollow. But Vance was terrified. I could feel it in the tremors of his muscles, see it in the way his hand gripped the iron. He was terrified, and he had fought anyway. That was the humanistic secret. That was the thing the hegemony had pruned away in their quest for perfection. Vance looked at the empty armor, then at the peacekeepers. The silence, he whispered. It's not gone. It's just resetting the board. What do you mean? I asked. Vance's grip on the iron tightened. They didn't come here to kill us, Zek. They came here to see if anyone was still home. He looked at the jagged hole in the ceiling, toward the darkness of the Velonis Reach. And they found me. The hegemony's peacekeeping was less about restoration and more about sanitization. Within 24 hours, the Aethelgard hub was flooded with worker drones. They didn't repair the obsidian pillars. They replaced them with new, identical ones. They didn't honor the dead. They vaporized the gray silt and updated the archives with a footnote about systemic instability. They tried to take Vance's armor 4 times. Each time I was there, I had claimed the power relay as my personal archival study zone. As a high-ranking Zillion scholar, I had certain jurisdictional privileges that even Exxon couldn't easily bypass without a formal decree from the hegemonic council. I spent those hours sitting in the cold dark, watching over the iron. Scylla stayed with me. She had changed. The airy, gaseous student who once dreamed of gas gowns was now obsessed with the physical properties of the Nullwalker shards. She had smuggled a handful of the glass-like fragments into our hideout, hidden in a vacuum-sealed canister. "Zek, look at this," she said, her form a focused, intense green. "I've been running the molecular resonance scans. These shards, they aren't alien." I looked up from my data slate. "What do you mean?" "They are constructed from hegemony materials," she whispered. "Refined carbonite, polarized glass, even traces of Vordonian crystal. But the molecular structure has been folded. It's like someone took our civilization and turned it inside out. My logic circuits stalled. That's impossible. The silence comes from beyond the reach." "Does it?" Scylla asked. "Or did we build it? Think about it, Zek. We have spent 3,000 years creating a perfect static society. We've eliminated conflict, diversity, and risk. What happens to all that entropic energy? Where does the noise of a civilization go when you force it into silence?" I looked at the iron armor. It seemed to pulse in the dim light, a dark heartbeat in a world of white noise. Vance was in the medical wing, under heavy guard. They told me he was recovering, but my access to his biometric feeds had been severed. Every time I tried to visit, I was met by peacekeepers with calming arrays. On the third day, the council arrived. This was not a group of peacekeepers. These were the archons of the hegemony, the oldest, most civilized beings in the galaxy. They didn't walk. They drifted on platforms of anti-gravity light. Their presence was a suffocating blanket of consensus. Archon Vallis, a being of pure, shimmering data mist, looked at me with 1,000 digital eyes. "Scholar Zek," he spoke, his voice a choir of 1,000,000 synthesized tones. "Your devotion to the human artifacts is noted, but the time for sentiment has passed. The hegemony must move forward. We require the armor for final disposal." "Disposal?" I stood up, my manipulators interlocked. "You mean erasure?" "Terminology is irrelevant," Vallis replied. "The human Vance is being repatriated to Earth. His species has proven themselves to be incompatible with the current hegemonic stability index. We are terminating their membership." I felt a cold shock. "You're casting them out? Because they saved us? Because they remind us of what we chose to leave behind?" Vallis said. "Their presence is a contaminant to our peace. They are a species that thrives on the very noise that creates the silence. To keep them is to invite further anomalies." He gestured to his attendants. "Secure the iron." The drones moved forward. I felt a surge of desperation. I looked at the armor, at the dents and the scratches. I thought of the 32 generations of Vances who had maintained this weight. "Stop!" Scylla screamed. She stepped forward, holding the canister of Nullwalker shards. "If you touch that armor, I will release these fragments into the station's main atmospheric processor." The Archon's light flickered with a brief, sharp calculation. "That would be an act of irrational violence, Scylla. It would contradict your very nature." "Maybe," Scylla said, her gas form turning a dark, dangerous violet. "But I've been spending a lot of time with humans lately. I'm learning that nature is just a word for people who are too afraid to change." The standoff lasted for 10 agonizing seconds. Then the heavy door of the relay hissed open. A man walked in. He was wearing a standard medical gown, which looked absurdly fragile on his scarred frame. He was pale, his movements stiff and painful. But he wasn't alone. Behind him walked 2 peacekeepers. But they weren't holding calming arrays. They were holding their heads, their crystalline bodies vibrating in a state of profound confusion. Vance walked to the center of the room. He didn't look at the Archons. He looked at the armor. "Hey, Zek," he said, his voice a low, gravelly rasp. "Told you the maintenance on this thing was a bitch. Look at all that frost." "Kaelen, you shouldn't be here," I said, moving to support him. Vance pushed me away gently. He reached out and touched the breastplate. He closed his eyes for a moment, and I saw a flicker of something in his expression. Not pain, but a deep, ancestral exhaustion. Archon Vallis's light form pulsed with irritation. "Captain Vance, your presence is unauthorized. You are being returned to your home world immediately." Vance turned his head, looking at the Archon through his one good eye. Home? You think you can just kick us out and the problem goes away? The human presence is a danger to the hegemony, Valis stated. Vance laughed. It was a wet, ragged sound. You don't get it, do you? The silence. It isn't an anomaly. It isn't noise. He leaned against the iron, his fingers tracing the gouges on the chest plate. I talked to them, he whispered. Out there, in the dark, when the relay blew. You talked to the Null Walkers? I asked, my logic cores spinning. They aren't aliens, Vance said, echoing Scylla's discovery. They're us. Or rather, they're what's left of every civilization you've stabilized over the last 3,000 years. He looked at the Archon, his gaze predatory. You think you've created peace, but you've just been harvesting the will to live from every species you touch. You take their art, their music, their history, and you strip away the parts that bite. You turn them into poets and philosophers who can't even lift a hand to save their own children. Vance's voice rose, filling the chamber with a terrifying human resonance. The silence is just the ghost of everything you've killed in the name of peace. And it's hungry. It's coming back to take the rest of you. Archon Valis's light turned a blinding, defensive white. This is heresy, a biological delusion, is it? Vance asked. He reached down and picked up the heavy helmet. He held it up to the Archon. Then why did my iron work? Why did my primitive sword shatter your anomaly? Because you can't delete the truth, Valis. You can't delete the fact that life is messy and violent and hard. And the moment you stop fighting for it, you stop being alive. You just become data. Vance slammed the helmet onto the floor. The sound echoed like a thunderclap. The hegemony is already dead, he said. You're just waiting for the void to realize it. He turned to me and Scylla. Grab the gear. We're leaving. Leaving? I asked. To where? To the Rim, Vance said. My people. We've been keeping a few museums out there. Real ones. With ships that don't use light shields and soldiers who don't need calming arrays. He looked at the iron armor, then back at me. The assignment's over, Zek. It's time to start the real work. I looked at the Archon, at the beautiful sterile light of the hegemony. Then I looked at the battered, blood-stained iron. I reached out and grabbed the sword. It was heavy. It was ugly. It was the most honest thing I had ever held. I'm a Xylian, I said, my voice vibrating with a new, illogical certainty. I don't leave history behind. I carry it. Scylla drifted to my side, her canister of shards glowing in her manipulators. And I'm a scientist. I want to see what happens when the noise finally fights back. Vance nodded. A small, grim smile touched his lips. All right then, let's move. We've got 1,200 years of momentum and a galaxy to wake up. We walked out of the power relay, leaving the Archons in their silent, shimmering perfection. We walked through the hub, past the replacement pillars and the vaporized ghosts. Vance led the way, his medical gown fluttering like a banner, his bare feet slapping against the cold floor. But he didn't look like a patient. He looked like a king returning to a kingdom that had forgotten his name. As we reached the hangar, I looked back one last time at the Aethelgard station. It was beautiful. It was perfect. And it was completely, utterly silent. But as the airlock hissed open and we stepped onto the human transport, I heard it. The sound of 1,000 iron boots. The sound of 1 billion voices that refused to be quieted. The sound of the universe finally beginning to scream. The transition from the sterile, silent corridors of Aethelgard to the interior of a human military transport, the Anvil's breath, was not a journey across space. It was a violent baptism into a different state of being. To a Xylian like myself, whose people had spent 3,000 years optimizing the acoustics of our habitats for maximum tranquility, the human ship was an affront to the very concept of peace. It hummed. Not a gentle, rhythmic pulse of a gravity drive, but a deep, bone-shaking thrum of massive kinetic engines and heavy shielding. It smelled of recycled oxygen, scorched lubricant, and the unmistakable salty tang of human perspiration. It was loud, crowded, and utterly, magnificently alive. Zek, if you keep vibrating like that, you're going to liquefy your own core, Vance said. He was sitting on a crate of ammunition, his upper body wrapped in med tape. He had refused the sedatives offered by the ship's medic, a woman named Sarah who looked like she had seen more trauma than the entire Aethelgard faculty combined. "I am simply adjusting to the ambient noise," I replied, my manipulators tightly interlaced to prevent the tremors. "This ship feels as though it is constantly on the verge of structural failure." Vance let out a short, dry laugh. "That's just the hull talking to you, Zek. She's been through 5 combat deployments and 2 asteroid storms. She's a bit cranky, but she'll hold. You can't trust a ship that doesn't groan when you push her." Scylla was at the far end of the bay, huddled with a group of human technicians. They were hunched over a holomap of the Veloni's reach, their voices a rapid-fire exchange of technical jargon and military slang. "So the static is ghosting the long-range arrays?" Scylla asked, her gas form pulsing a sharp, inquisitive green. "Yeah," a technician replied, a grizzled man with a cybernetic eye that whirred as it focused. "We're blind on the 6. The brass thinks it's just void interference, but I've seen this before on the rim. It's like the universe is just deciding not to report back." "It's FUBAR, kid." "FUBAR," Scylla echoed, her vibration suggesting she was recording the word for later analysis. "Fouled up beyond all recognition," Vance translated from across the bay. "It's the unofficial motto of the human species." We were heading toward the iron-bound territories, a cluster of systems on the extreme edge of the galaxy that the hegemony had officially designated as the Wastelands. To the Archons, these were dead rocks, resource-poor and tactically irrelevant. To the humans, they were the fortress. 6 light-years from the station, the Anvil's breath began its descent toward a planet called Bastion 4. It wasn't a world of soaring spires or crystalline gardens. From orbit, it looked like a rusted marble, its surface scarred by massive industrial complexes and deep, jagged trenches. "Welcome to the family business," Vance whispered as the ship entered the atmosphere. The landing was not a graceful descent. It was a controlled fall, the atmospheric thrusters screaming as they fought the planet's heavy gravity. When the ramp finally lowered, I stepped out into a world that felt like a physical weight on my sensory nodes. The sky was a bruised purple, choked with the exhaust of 1,000 foundries. The air was thick and tasted of iron. Everywhere I looked, I saw the same pattern. People moving with purpose, carrying crates, sharpening blades, welding plates onto massive kinetic walkers. This wasn't a colony. It was an armory that happened to have a population. "Vance!" a voice boomed from the crowd. A man approached, older than Vance, but built with the same uncompromising density. He wore a suit of armor that looked even older than the one Vance had brought to the academy. A heavy, blocky configuration of matte black steel that looked like it belonged to a different species entirely. "General," Vance said, snapping a sharp, crisp salute despite his injuries. "Drop the formalities, Kaelen," the man said, pulling Vance into a brief, bruising embrace. "We heard the sit rep from Aethelgard. You made a hell of a mess of their hub. The assignment was to show them the armor, sir. I figured a live demonstration was more educational." General Silas Vance, Kaelen's uncle, I would later learn, turned his gaze toward me and Scylla. "And these are the civilized guests you brought back? A puddle and a cloud?" "They're scholars, Uncle," Vance said, his tone shifting into something protective. "Zek is the best archivist the Zillions have, and Scylla, she's the only one who figured out that the Silence is using our own tech against us." Silas grunted, his cybernetic armor humming. "Scholars, huh? Well, the library's been turned into a munitions depot, but I suppose we can find a corner for them. Follow me. We've got a situation brewing on Oros Prime." Oros Prime. The name sent a chill through my logic cores. It was the cultural heart of the hegemony, a world dedicated to the preservation of galactic art and philosophy. It was home to over 5 billion sentient beings, and its defenses were entirely based on diplomatic immunity and light shield arrays. "The Silence hit the Oros Gate 2 hours ago," Silas said as we walked through the subterranean tunnels of the Bastion. "The Hegemony Council is still debating whether or not to issue a formal protest. They're refusing to authorize a counterstrike. They say it's a misunderstanding of cosmic proportions." 5 billion lives," Scylla whispered, her form thinning in distress. "They'll be gone in a day." Silas stopped and looked at her. Her green light reflected off his black armor. They won't be gone in a day, kid. The silence doesn't work that fast. It eats the soul first. It silences the music, turns the lights off, and waits for the people to give up. Then it just folds them. He turned to Vance. The Council of the Unbroken is meeting in an hour. They want to hear your report. They want to know if the Aegis held. It held, Kaelen said, his hand resting on the hilt of his sword, but the man inside nearly didn't. I watched them, these two humans, discussing the death of a world as if it were a tactical puzzle. There was no poetry here, no beautiful metaphors for existence. There was only the weight of the iron and the cold, hard reality of survival. And yet, as I looked at the people of Bastion 4, the children training with wooden swords, the elders maintaining the ancient looms for ballistic weave, I realized that they weren't the monsters I had been taught to fear. They were something far more tragic. They were the people who had never been allowed to forget that the world was dangerous. Kaelen, I asked as we reached the council chambers, why Oros Prime? Why would you save a world that views you as a primitive anomaly? Vance paused at the door. He looked at me with his one good eye, and for the first time, I saw the humanistic lesson he had been trying to teach us all along. Because being the bigger person isn't about pride, Zek. It's about the fact that if we let Oros burn, we're just proving the silence right. We're proving that the only thing that matters is the dark. He tapped his chest, where the iron armor had been. My family didn't start the iron-bound tradition to win wars, Zek. We started it to make sure there was still a world worth winning. He pushed the door open. The room was filled with humans of every age and background, all wearing the scars of their lineage. This was the Council of the Unbroken. They weren't waiting for a vote. They were waiting for a leader. And as I watched Kaelen Vance walk to the center of the room, I realized that my own journey, from a scholar of the past to a witness of the present, was only just beginning. I wasn't just recording history anymore. I was part of the noise that was going to save it. The Council of the Unbroken was a loud, chaotic affair that would have induced a systemic shutdown in any hegemony official. There were no calm light arrays here, only the shouting of 50 different clan leaders, each one representing a lineage that had survived for at least 500 years. Oros is a suicide mission, shouted a woman with a shock of white hair and a suit of articulated copper. We don't have the fleet strength to punch through a void shroud that size. If we don't punch through, we're next, countered a younger man, his face painted with the ritual ash of the Martian mining guilds. The silence is a scavenger, Elena. It eats the weak first. Kaelen Vance stood in the center of the storm, silent as a mountain. He didn't shout. He didn't argue. He simply waited for the entropic energy of the room to burn itself out. Finally, General Silas stepped forward and hammered his gauntlet against the metal table. Enough! We're not here to debate the weather. Kaelen, you were on the station. You saw the Null Walkers up close. Tell them. Kaelen stepped into the flickering light of the holoprojector. They aren't invincible, he said, his voice cutting through the remaining whispers. They're built out of our own complacency. Every time we choose safety over truth, every time we trade our history for a light shield, we give them another brick for their walls. He pointed to Scylla, who was floating nervously near the ceiling. Our guest here found the key. The silence isn't a void. It's a reflection. It's what happens when you try to delete the messiness of life. Scylla drifted down, her form pulsing a determined neon green. It's a resonance problem, she explained, her voice gaining strength. The hegemony tech is based on perfect harmonics, clean, predictable waves. The Null Walkers just flip those waves and cancel them out. That's why your light shields vanish. They aren't being broken. They're being countered. But human tech, I added, stepping forward to stand beside my friends. Human tech is noisy. It is imperfect. The iron, the kinetic shells, the raw, unrefined energy of your engines. It creates a chaotic frequency that the silence cannot predict. So what are you saying? The woman named Elena asked, her voice skeptical. We're going to save Oros by being loud? Exactly, Kaelen said. We're going to drop into the Oros system with every rusty hull and screaming engine we have. We're going to broadcast every piece of human music, every recording of a protest, every shout of a soldier across the entire spectrum. We're going to turn Oros Prime into the loudest place in the galaxy. The council went silent. The idea was so tactically absurd, so contrary to every principle of galactic warfare, that it felt like a joke. And while the silence is reeling from the noise, Vance continued, his eyes turning toward the map of Oros Prime. I'm going down to the planet. Alone? I asked, my fluid core tightening. Not alone, Vance said. I'm taking the Aegis, and I'm taking the archives. He looked at me. Zek, I need you to do something that violates every Zillion protocol. I need you to open the Aethelgard remote link. I need you to download the entire library of human conflict into the Oros planetary defense grid. I froze. Kaelen, that is 5 terabytes of raw, unfiltered violence. It will traumatize the entire population. It will be an aesthetic catastrophe. Vance grabbed my manipulators. His hands were rough, but his touch was steady. They can't be traumatized if they're dead, Zek. They need to remember how to be angry. They need to remember how to fight. If they don't find their own noise, they're going to vanish into the quiet. The humanistic theme was screaming at me now. It wasn't about the armor anymore. It was about the choice. Did I preserve the purity of the Oros scholars, or did I give them the ugly, blood-stained tools they needed to survive? I looked at Scylla. She nodded, her green light flickering with a fierce new intensity. I'll do it, I whispered, but I'm going with you. Vance blinked. Zek, you're an archivist. You'll be in the middle of a hot zone. I am a Zillion, I repeated, echoing my words from the station, and I have learned that a library is only as valuable as the people who are willing to protect it. The decision was made. The Council of the Unbroken voted to mobilize, not out of hope, but out of a stubborn ancestral refusal to be the last one standing. The next 48 hours were a blur of preparation. I watched as the humans loaded their ships. They weren't just taking weapons, they were taking their stories. I saw one soldier carefully packing a physical book of poetry from the 19th century next to his plasma cutter. I saw another technician tuning the ship's comms array to play a recording of a thunderstorm on repeat. Vance spent the time in the forge. He was rebuilding the Aegis. He wouldn't let anyone else touch it. I watched as he welded a new shoulder plate onto the armor, his movements heavy and rhythmic. You're thinking about the blood, aren't you? He asked, not looking up from his work. I was thinking about the courage, I replied. I used to think courage was a lack of fear, Kaelen. I thought it was a calculation, a decision that the objective was worth the risk. And now I think courage is the ability to hold on to your own noise when the universe is trying to make you quiet. Vance stopped the welding torch. He looked at the armor, then at me. That's a good one, Zek. You should put that in your archive. The fleet launched at 2300 hours Bastion time. It was a motley collection of ships, mining haulers, ancient frigates, and one massive scarred carrier called the Mother of Necessity. We hit the Oros gate like a hammer. The silence was waiting. As soon as we exited warp, the gray static began to claw at the anvil's breath. The lights flickered, the gravity drive groaned, and for a moment I felt that familiar, soul-crushing cold. But then the noise started. Across every frequency, every channel, every speaker on every ship, the humans began to play. It was a wall of sound, drums, screaming guitars, the roar of oceans, the laughter of children, the shouting of crowds. It was the collective no of a species that had spent 10,000 years refusing to be quiet. The effect on the Nullwalkers was immediate. The gray shards, which had moved with such terrifying precision at Aethelgard, began to vibrate. They shifted and buckled, their geometric forms unable to maintain their shape against the chaotic resonance of the human fleet. "They're breaking!" Scylla shouted from the sensor station. "The static is failing! Launch the pods!" Vance commanded. I found myself strapped into a drop pod next to Kaelen and Scylla. The iron armor was locked into the frame, Vance already inside it. He looked like a statue of ancient grief, his hands gripping his sword. "Zek, if we don't make it," Vance's voice came through the comlink, muffled by his helmet. "Make sure someone writes down that we didn't go quietly." "I'll write it in iron, Kaelen," I replied. The pod launched. The descent toward Oros Prime was a journey through fire and shadow. Below us, The beautiful white cities of the hegemony were already being shrouded in gray dust. The silence was winning. The people of Oros were huddled in their galleries, waiting for a peace that would never come. But then our pods hit the ground. We crashed into the center of the Grand Plaza of Oros, right in front of the Temple of Perpetual Harmony. The door of our pod exploded outward, and Kaelen Vance stepped out into the gray mist. The Null Walkers drifted toward him, their humming static trying to drown him out. Vance didn't use a light shield. He didn't use a calming array. He raised his sword and slammed it against his iron breastplate, a loud, brutal, physical clang that echoed through the plaza like a gunshot. "Wake up!" he roared, his voice amplified by the station's stolen speakers. "Wake up and fight!" In that moment, the theme of the story moved from the subtext to the very heart of the action. This wasn't about humans being better than the hegemony. It was about the realization that every civilization, no matter how advanced, needs its noise. It needs its scars. It needs its iron. Because without the noise, there is no music. Without the scars, there is no history. And without the iron, there is no tomorrow. I opened my data slate and began the upload. I sent the records of the trenches, the sieges, the riots, and the revolutions directly into the minds of the 5 billion scholars of Oros Prime. I gave them the gift of human pain, and for the first time in 3,000 years, the people of Oros Prime didn't pray for peace. They screamed. The war for the soul of the galaxy had begun. The Grand Plaza of Oros Prime, once a sanctuary of absolute silence and geometric perfection, had become a symphony of chaos. The air, which had been as still as a tomb for 3,000 years, was now thick with the sound of 5 billion souls experiencing 10,000 years of human history in a single, concentrated burst. It wasn't just the violence that I had uploaded, it was the laughter, the crying of infants, the roar of stadiums, and the whispered promises of lovers. It was the noise of life, raw and unedited, and it was tearing the Null Walkers apart. Kaelen Vance stood at the epicenter of the storm. His iron armor was no longer dark. It was glowing with a dull, heated orange from the sheer friction of the void static trying to erase him. He was a silhouette of ancient defiance, his sword sweeping through the gray mist in wide, brutal arcs. Each strike didn't just cut through the shards, it shattered the reality they were trying to impose. "They're fading!" Scylla screamed, her gas form surging with a brilliant, golden light. Her resonance was no longer a delicate hum. It was a piercing, triumphant chime that harmonized with the human music blaring from the overhead speakers. "The static is collapsing. They can't handle the data load." I watched from the steps of the Temple of Perpetual Harmony as the first Erosian moved. He was a lithoid, a being of pale marble and soft lavender light. For centuries he had stood in this plaza, contemplating the stillness of the universe. Now his facets were vibrating with a frantic, jagged rhythm. He looked at his hands, then at the gray dust falling from the sky. He didn't pray. He didn't seek logical equilibrium. He reached down, picked up a heavy piece of fallen obsidian, and hurled it at a passing Null Walker. It was a clumsy, primitive gesture. It was a complete rejection of 3 millennia of civilized evolution. And it was the most beautiful thing I had ever seen. The shard he hit didn't just absorb the blow. It cracked. The Null Walker spun away, its gray static fizzling out as the lithoid's sudden, sharp intent disrupted its programming. "Vance!" I yelled through the comm link. "The population is waking up. They're joining the fight. Copy that, Zek." Vance's voice came through, ragged and breathless. "Tell them to stay frosty. This isn't over until the shroud breaks." He was right. While the local shards were destabilizing, the massive void shroud hanging over the planet was still drawing power from the Oros Gate. We were winning the plaza, but we were losing the world. "Scylla, I need you to boost the signal," I commanded, my manipulators flying across the interface of my data slate. "I'm going to patch the human fleet's noise broadcast directly into the planetary ley lines. We need to turn the entire crust of the planet into a tuning fork." "On it," Scylla replied. "But Zek, if we do that, the feedback might fry the station's archives. We could lose the records." I paused for a fraction of a second. I thought about the millions of scrolls, the digital tapestries, and the silent histories I had sworn to protect. Then I looked at the lithoid, who was now standing shoulder to shoulder with a human soldier, both of them shouting into the dark. "The records are just ink and light, Scylla," I said. "These people are the history. Burn the archives. Save the world." Scylla's golden form flared with a heat that rivaled a small sun. "Understood. Initiating the burn in 3, 2, 1. The world turned white. It wasn't the sterile white of a laboratory. It was the blinding, holy white of a star being born. The noise broadcast hit the planet's core and bounced back, amplified by the very carbonite and crystal the hegemony had used to build their perfect world. The sound was no longer music or shouting. It was a physical force, a wall of pure, unadulterated existence that pushed back against the silence. I felt the ground beneath my feet groan. The grand plaza cracked. The obsidian pillars, those symbols of static peace, shattered into a million pieces. Through the roar, I heard the void shroud scream. It was a high-pitched, metallic shriek, the sound of a vacuum being filled with something it couldn't swallow. And then, the sky broke. The gray mist evaporated, replaced by the brilliant, stinging blue of the Erosian sun. The Nullwalkers didn't retreat. They simply ceased to be, their forms unable to exist in a world that had rediscovered its own heartbeat. Silence fell over the plaza, but it wasn't the old silence. It was the silence of 100,000 people catching their breath. It was the silence of a wounded animal that had just realized it was still alive. Kaelen Vance collapsed. He didn't fall gracefully. He hit the ground with a heavy metallic thud, his sword slipping from his gauntleted hand. I ran to him, my fluid core churning with a frantic heat. "Kaelen!" I reached the armor and began to unlatch the seals. The iron was hot to the touch, the metal scarred and pitted in ways that should have been impossible. When I finally pulled the helmet away, I saw a man who looked like he had been through the end of the world and back. He was pale, his skin covered in a layer of gray dust and dried blood. His breathing was shallow, his eyes closed. "Vance, talk to me," I whispered, my manipulators trembling. "Don't you dare die after all that." His eyes flickered open. They were bloodshot and tired, but the blue fire was still there, burning low in the grate. Did we get full marks?" he rasped, a tiny bloody smile touching his lips. I let out a sound that was half laugh, half sob. "You passed, Kaelen. You passed with honors." Scylla drifted down, her form dim and exhausted. "The fleet is reporting the shroud is gone. The silence is retreating to the outer rim. They're leaving us alone." "For now," Vance whispered, his hand finding the edge of his breastplate. I looked around the plaza. The peacekeepers were standing there, their light arrays dark and useless. The archons were gone, their platforms having fled at the first sign of real conflict. The only ones left were the people, the primitive humans in their iron, and the awakened Erosians in their broken marble. General Silas walked toward us, his black armor covered in the soot of the battle. He looked at his nephew, then at me and Scylla. He didn't offer a salute. He didn't give a speech. He simply reached down and picked up Vance's sword, handing it back to him with a grim, respectful nod. "The galaxy's a bit louder today," Silas said. Vance took the sword, his fingers closing around the worn leather grip. "Yeah," he replied, looking up at the blue sky. "It's about time." The immediate aftermath was a blur of triage and reconstruction, but it wasn't the hegemony doing the work. It was a new coalition, an alliance of those who had chosen to be noisy. I saw a Vordonian scholar using his light shield to keep a human child warm. I saw a Yanari diplomat arguing with a human sergeant about the best way to rebuild a hospital, their voices loud and passionate. The conflict was resolving, but not into the old peace. It was resolving into a state of dynamic, messy, beautiful tension. I sat on the steps of the temple, my data slate empty of the old archives but full of new entries. I watched Scylla as she helped a group of sylphids stabilize their gaseous forms using the resonance of a human violin. The lesson was beginning to sink in. The hegemony had tried to protect us from the dark by turning off all the lights. They had tried to keep us safe by making us small, but Vance had shown us that the only way to truly survive the dark is to carry your own fire, even if it burns you, even if it leaves scars, because a scar is just a memory that refused to be forgotten. And as I looked at the iron armor sitting in the sun, I realized that I didn't want the clean version anymore. I wanted the dents, I wanted the stains, I wanted the truth. 3 months had passed since the Battle of Oros Prime. The galaxy was not the same place it had been for the last 3,000 years. The hegemony had not collapsed, but its authority had withered, replaced by a decentralized network of worlds that called themselves the Resonance Accord. We were no longer a collection of civilized species hiding behind a light shield. We were a community of survivors who had agreed to keep the noise going. Aethelgard Station was being rebuilt, but this time, the architects weren't lithoid scholars or Zillion archivists. They were a mixed team of every species in the Accord. The new design wasn't translucent and fragile. It was built with a core of structural steel and reinforced carbonite. It had gardens, yes, but it also had hangars. It had libraries, but it also had forges. I was standing in the new Hall of History, which occupied the space where the old power relay had once been. The air was no longer sterile. It smelled of sawdust, ozone, and the faint, sweet scent of Erosion honey bread. "Zek, you're late for the inaugural lecture." I turned to see Scylla drifting toward me. She was glowing a vibrant, healthy gold, and she was wearing a small, physical pendant around her neck, a piece of a Null Walker shard encased in human glass. "I am not late, Scylla," I replied, my manipulators adjusting the settings on my new data slate. "I am merely ensuring that the centerpiece is properly calibrated." I gestured to the central pedestal of the hall. It wasn't a holographic display. It wasn't a light tapestry. It was the Aegis of Saul. The iron armor sat there, cleaned but not polished. The dents from the Null Walkers were still there. The scratches from the siege of New Kyoto were still there. And if you look closely at the leather straps, you could still see the faint, dark shadows of 32 generations of blood. It was the most popular exhibit in the station. "Where is he?" Scylla asked, looking around the bustling hall. "He's in the garden," I said. "He says the light is better there for maintenance." Shabiana, I found Kaelen Vance sitting on a bench made of reclaimed structural steel, overlooking the Velonis Reach. He wasn't wearing his uniform. He was wearing a simple human shirt and trousers, his scarred arms resting on his knees. Beside him sat a young lithoid student, no more than 20 cycles old. The student was holding a small rusted piece of metal, a fragment of a colonial hull, and a piece of abrasive cloth. No, you're pressing too hard," Vance was saying, his voice patient and low. "You're not trying to erase the metal, kid. You're trying to talk to it. Feel that ridge there? That's where the heat shield buckled. If you polish that flat, you're losing the story of how that ship got home." The lithoid student nodded, his facets flickering with a soft, inquisitive light. "Talk to the metal." "Understood, Captain." Vance looked up as I approached. He looked older, the lines around his eyes deeper, but the exhaustion I had seen on Oros Prime had been replaced by a quiet, steady purpose. "Zek," he said, nodding. "How's the archive?" "It is loud, Kaelen," I replied, settling onto the bench beside him. "We have received over 10,000 submissions of family heirlooms in the last month. Everyone wants to contribute their noise to the collection. We have everything from broken violins to scarred industrial drills." Vance smiled, a real, genuine smile that didn't involve any blood. "Good. A museum shouldn't be a place where things go to die. It should be a place where they go to stay awake." He stood up, stretching his back. The lithoid student gathered his things and offered a respectful bow before scurrying away to join his classmates. Vance walked to the edge of the garden, staring out at the stars. The human fleet was visible in the distance, their ships no longer hiding their kinetic signatures. They were bright, noisy, and defiant. "You've changed, Kaelen," I said. He looked back at me. "Yeah? How so? When we met, you were carrying that armor like it was a prison. You were waiting for the world to break so you could prove you were right to be afraid?" Vance was quiet for a long moment. The only sound was the hum of the station's life support and the distant clanging of a construction drone. "I wasn't afraid of the world breaking, Zek," he said softly. "I was afraid of being the only one who remembered how to fix it." He reached into his pocket and pulled out his old cracked pen. He turned it over in his fingers. "My grandfather used to say that the iron isn't for the soldier. It's for the grandfather. We wear it so our grandchildren don't have to. But we keep it. We keep it so they never forget that they could." He looked at the pen, then tucked it back away. I used to think that the assignment was about survival, about making sure the human species didn't get deleted by the universe. But I was wrong. He turned to face me, his one good eye bright with a new understanding. The assignment is about responsibility. It's about being the person who's willing to hold the door open even when it's heavy, especially when it's heavy, because if you don't hold it, the room gets very quiet, very fast. He walked over to a small flowering plant, a gift from the erosion survivors, and gently adjusted its position so it could catch more of the artificial sunlight. I'm not a soldier anymore, Zek. I'm just a guy with a very old suit of clothes and a lot of stories to tell. And I think I'm okay with that. He reached out and patted my manipulator, a human gesture of friendship that no longer felt alien or threatening. It felt like home. See you at the lecture, Professor, he said, his voice light with humor. I watched him walk away, his footsteps still heavy, still rhythmic, but no longer predatory. He moved with the ease of a man who had finally found a world that was loud enough for him. I stayed in the garden for a long time, looking back on the journey that had started with a simple question about bloodstains. I thought about the archons and their sterile peace. I thought about the nullwalkers and their hollow void. And then I thought about us, the zillions, the humans, the lithoids, the sylphids, all of us clanging our iron against the dark. I realize now that the history of the galaxy isn't a straight line from violence to peace. It's a circle. We fight to survive, we survive to grow, and we grow to remember. And in that remembering, we find the strength to face the next fight. I spent cycles trying to categorize humanity as a death world species, a violent anomaly in a civilized galaxy. But the truth is, the humans aren't the anomaly. They are the reminder. They are the part of ourselves we tried to prune away because it was too hard to look at. They are the scars that prove we are still alive. I looked down at my data slate and began to type the final entry for the day. Archive entry, cycle 4212. The hegemony is gone. The resonance has begun. We are noisy. We are scarred. We are heavy. And for the first time in 3,000 years, we are not afraid. I looked at the iron armor one last time before the lights dimmed for the station's night cycle. It looked peaceful there, standing guard over the memories of 1,000 years. It was no longer a weapon, it was a promise that as long as there is someone willing to carry the weight, the lights will never truly go out. I find myself wondering, as I sit here in the quiet of the garden, about the things we all carry. We all have our own version of that iron, the memories that weigh us down, the scars we try to polish away, the bloodstains of our past mistakes. We try so hard to be clean, to be perfect, to be silent. But I wonder, is there a part of you that you have been trying to hide, thinking it makes you less civilized? A dent in your own armor that you're ashamed of? What if you stop trying to polish it? What if you realize that that very scar is the only thing that will hold when the world finally gets loud? What part of your own noise are you finally ready to embrace? I looked up at the stars, and for the first time, they didn't look distant or cold. They looked like sparks from a forge, waiting for someone to pick up the hammer. Kaelen Vance walked back into the hall, picked up a discarded rag, and began to slowly, carefully clean a small smudge of dust from the armor's greave. He wasn't finishing the work. He was just getting started.